Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the October Arc and His Society lecture. My name is Sebastian. I am the Vice President of Activities. And today we have the honor of having Andrea Torvinen. She's going to be talking to us about her work in Mexico. But before that, I know our president, Eric, wants to say a couple of things, a couple of announcements. So, Eric, go ahead.
Thank you, Sebastian, and welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing this talk, as I'm sure that all of you are as well. I will be very quick so we can get right to the lecture. I just wanted to remind everyone of a couple of events that will be coming up. The first is the annual Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society book sale, which is November 14th and 15th on the U of A campus on the lawn in front of the north building of the Arizona State Museum. For those that are in town, I encourage you to stop by. It's quite a collection of materials, and the money from that, the proceeds go to help fund the library of the Arizona State Museum. The second is that on January 11th, we will be having our winter party. It will be held at the San Pedro Chapel, which I believe we've had a recent one there. Many of you likely know where it is. It's on Old Fort Lowell, just to the west of Craycroft. There will be a silent auction and a couple of to be announced later speakers to provide some insight on the historical period and prehistoric period of the area. So if anyone also there will for the silent auction, if there is anyone that has anything that they could donate to that, we are accepting donations. You can either contact me directly or Fran Muriel, whose email was in the November glyphs, which was just recently distributed. So you all should have an opportunity to see that. So that is all that I've got. So Sebastian, if you want to take it from there, and we'll get the festivities going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Eric. So as I previously mentioned, today we have Dr. Andrea Torvinen. She's the collection manager at the University of Florida. And she's going to be talking about her work in Mexico. Before I turn it over to her, just one thing. We're going to do the questions at the end of the lecture. So if you have any questions, please write them on the chat or the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Just write them there, and she will get to it at the end. So, Andrea, the screen is yours. Welcome.
Right. Hello, thank you. Let me make sure I get my screen share right. Okay. Does that look right to you, Sebastian? Excellent. Okay. Good evening. Thank you to Sebastian and the AAHS for the invitation to speak to you all. I looked at some of your recent speakers, and I was happy to see some of my friends and colleagues among them. And it's nice to see the AAHS looking south of the border and even past the sort of traditional southwestern region. So let's get started. For those of you who have never heard of La Quemada, I'm going to start this talk with kind of a brief site tour overview of the site, give you a sense of the scale and monumentality of it. Then I'm going to dive into the weeds a bit on the sort of theoretical framework of my research, explain the sorts of proxy data that I use to understand social identities in the past, and then finally how I use those to explore the potential for collective action among past societies. And then if I have time at the end, I'll give you a little insight into some of the ongoing and future work that we have going on. So around 500 CE, residents in the Malpaso Valley of Zacatecas, Mexico began to construct a place of congregation. As it grew over the next 4 centuries, architects and builders modified the mountaintop and added massive walls, ball courts, temples, internal causeways, and valley-wide roads, ultimately making up the National Monumento Arqueológico known today as La Quemada. In its heyday, La Quemada served some 200 villages in the surrounding 120 kilometers, and visitors came from the wider northern frontier of Mesoamerica. This included the states of Zacatecas, Jalisco, Durango, Aguascalientes, Nayarit, and Sinaloa. The site was abandoned around 900 CE, but its buildings were so well engineered that many still stand today. Of several such centers in this pre-Hispanic northern frontier, La Quemada is one of the most spectacular and best studied. Its development by the National Institute of Archaeology and History, or the INAH, as a tourist attraction, museum, and educational center have spurred public and scholarly interest. And so over the past 30 years, the La Quemada Malpaso Valley Archaeological Project, which I now co-direct with Dr. Ben Nelson, has considerably improved our understanding of the site and shown that it was an important place to the region's inhabitants, even long after its abandonment. This research program is important because it affords new perspectives on a wider process of pre-Hispanic expansion and contraction of the northern frontier of Mesoamerica. The expansion was marked by the appearance of new ceremonial centers across the frontier during the Epiclassic period. Scholars have proposed different reasons for the expansion. Perhaps the most intriguing are suggestions that La Quemada formed part of a Mesoamerican world system that reached from southern and central Mexico into the U.S. Southwest. As such, the LQMVAP, our project, was designed to evaluate both interregional connections and explore regional and local scale phenomena. We've achieved perspective on the local scale by conducting fieldwork at a few sites in a regional polity located on La Quemada. And then we've tested those predictions derived from competing theories about the processes that drove the expansion. The competition pits environmental drivers against political economic ones. So as a U.S. team working in Mexico, our fieldwork was authorized by the Mexican government under a permit from the INAH, beginning with early survey work and dating back to 1987 and extending through 7 field seasons at this primate center of La Quemada, a secondary ceremonial center called Los Pilarillos, and a hamlet called El Pochorito. We have maintained a consistent presence within Zacatecas by renting a lab space in the city, which is our ASU archaeology lab. There we curate over 500,000 specimens, but we're getting ready to hand those over, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. So in seeking alternative explanations for the frontier expansion phenomenon, our research team has concentrated on such themes such as long-distance exchange and the effects of natural climate change or human-induced environmental alterations, but has not ignored the possibility that the local growth was the product of a dynamic of local and interregional social change. Other topics explored in depth are the possibility that the expansion was accompanied by interethnic conflict, as well as mobility involved in ritual practice across the landscape, employing ethnographic analogy based on descendant communities. The case study I'm presenting to you today involves an exploration of collective social identities among the residents of La Quemada that draws on ceramic proxy data for social identification. So what you're seeing here is a map of La Quemada, where it is situated on a rhyolitic dome overlooking the Malpaso Valley. Therefore, site construction involved terracing large areas to create flat living spaces within the built environment. So as I said, before I'm going to get in the weeds on the case study and the details of the analysis, I'm going to try and give you a sort of virtual tour of the site itself in case you've never been there or won't be able to in your lifetime. So down in the southern end, we have what's called the Hall of Columns, and you can see a few images of what that structure actually looks like today. It would have originally been covered with a roof, and there's evidence of burning, there's evidence of bodies that would have been hanging in bundles or on display within the structure itself, but a pretty massive monumental piece of architecture. Just outside of that Hall of Columns, there's this big open plaza space, which could have been used for a variety of different purposes. And looking back from that vantage point, kind of north towards the hilltop, you're seeing a bit of what the site itself looks like from that perspective. Turning a little bit to the right then, you see we have a large eye-shaped ball court, very distinctively Mesoamerican. And at the north end of that, there is a large structure that's called the votive pyramid. When you walk towards that end of the ball court, then you would turn to your left a little bit and you're able to see what's referred to as the grand staircase. And this provided a much more direct route to the upper levels of the site than just kind of meandering your way through some of the terraces on the western flank. When you get up to the top and look back down, then you get a bit better sense of the scale of some of that architecture we were seeing from below. And I like to include this photo as a juxtaposition of what this space looks like in the dry season, which you're seeing in the upper right, versus the wet season on the left. Quite a drastic difference in the landscape, depending on the season you're there. There is a structure called the cuartel in the upper portions of the site here. It seems very Pueblo-like, so it was hypothesized to be sort of a late introduction into the site or a late reoccupation of the site. But it doesn't seem like the dating is panning out quite like that. It's not an area where I work, so I'm not going to be able to say too much more about that. But this photo I like because it gives you a sense of the scale of this cliff sides. And so we're going to talk about middens being over cliffs later. And so you can kind of imagine people just throwing their trash over the edge to form those trash middens. This photo, you can see where the little person is on the map. We're looking back out from the site into the valley. And this is a dry season photo, obviously. And what we're going to see, and it might be not as obvious to the untrained eye, is a large road structure coming into the base of the site. Hopefully you're all oohing and ahhing because you could see it finally with the yellow that I added on the screen there. But there's a bunch of different causeways that extend out into the site, and they all tend to converge at some of these important places in the landscape. La Quemada, as the largest site in the valley, obviously being one of those. There is a space in the upper portions here called the Plaza de los Sacrificios. It's a rounded structure in the middle, so it's kind of strange because a lot of the other architecture at the site is angular and square in form. This is an area where, again, we had a lot of human bodies displayed, sort of grouped by body part. It's a strange deposit, but again, very Mesoamerican type of site. We're seeing human sacrifice potentially, or at least the display of human remains within a site. This is an overview of one of the larger, what we call patio banquette structures. So if you can see my mouse, this is a little altar here in the middle. This is a sunken patio space in the center then, with the built-up rooms around the outside. And then you're actually seeing a pyramid, like the one there, it's actually the same one, on the edge of the northern edge of that patio banquette structure. When you go all the way to the northern end of the site there, we have a space called the Ciudadela, and there is another pyramid structure that was excavated in the past. It had a very interesting copa olla complex buried underneath it. There's also a smaller Hall of Columns space that I don't have a very good photo of to show, but a somewhat more reserved, restricted sort of space on the northern end of the site. So finally coming around, there's another staircase heading into the north, and there is a very large sort of encircling wall that protects that whole northern edge, which led to a lot of early theories around warfare within the valley. That's what the causeways might have been used for, was moving troops around. Can't rule it out completely, but we don't see a lot of other evidence for too much interethnic or intergroup violence at the site. Okay, and so just to emphasize here on the map, the red circles you're seeing amongst all the other circles are the middens that we actually excavated on our project, and the team that I co-direct now. The La Quemada Malpaso Valley Archaeological Project also excavated Terrace 18, which you see on the map here, and it's a bit difficult to see, so I added the yellow again to help show the extent. We're looking from above, kind of down onto Terrace 18. And so this entire terrace was excavated as part of during one of the field seasons of the project. This is a nice map then showing you what the actual architecture looks like. We refer to these as report areas or architectural areas within the terrace itself. It was one of the largest of the nearly 60 terraces that were recorded at La Quemada, and so we systematically excavated that back in the 90s. The architectural layout of the terrace consists of, again, one of those sunken central plazas that I was talking about, and it's surrounded by a raised banquette on top of which were built some small patio groups. So you've got patio groups within a larger patio group, basically. It's sort of a nested dolls effect. In the architecture, there are also a set of 3 platforms that were likely the foundation for perishable structures, as well as a temple on the west edge of the patio. It's called the temple because we see human remains here again that were hung in bundles. There was also possibly a zimpotli or a skull rack that was on this western edge of the banquette. This terrace also includes a miniature ball court within the middle of the patio space and a causeway that would have actually brought people in as a main entrance from the west. So this means that the activities that took place in this specific area of the site involved behaviors that were likely associated with entering a sacred site. Pilgrimage is still practiced among the descendant communities of this area, and that's something we draw a lot on for the ethnographic analogy of how we interpret the use of this site. So a space like this was likely occupied by an extended family. Therefore, the material culture that we recovered from the terrace itself in these architectural areas, we assume to represent the social identities of a multi-household unit. So going forward, you'll hear me talk about the Terrace 18 scale a lot, and I'm referring to the material that came from this particular residential terrace. So getting into the theoretical meat. I draw on a resilience framework for my research. And so in the quote that you're seeing on the slide here, this is one of many definitions of this resilience concept. This concept was originally developed in ecology, where the relationships between different species within an ecological community and the drivers of change have been theorized and documented with great success. Now, when considering the topic of resilience within the social sciences, this concept can appear to become quite vague. Simply stating that a social ecological system is resilient doesn't tell us all that much, actually. We should be thinking more about resilient to what and for whom. How was resilience achieved and at what cost to the people actually living in this system? So from this perspective, resilience thinking points us in the direction of understanding what people do and how they think, how ecological systems behave, and how to avoid being vulnerable to different circumstances. So the operationalization of this framework as a comparative methodology informs our understanding of robustness-vulnerability trade-offs in social ecological systems. The role that social diversity plays in how communities transform in response to challenges, as well as the identification of varying strategies for enhancing resilience within the social realm. So in the case study I'm presenting today, I'm employing a multi-scalar network methods to explore the impact that collective action can have on the long-term resilience of a community in Northwest Mexico in particular. So during the Epiclassic period, the northern frontier consisted of a series of polities and hilltop centers distributed along river valleys that feed southward into the Lerma-Santiago drainage and then westward out to the Pacific coast. Recent research has focused on understanding how closely these polities interacted, what forms their interactions took, and the extent to which the growth and decline of these polities was synchronized or fluctuated over time. For example, La Quemada, located in the Malpaso Valley of Zacatecas, Mexico, fell out of the regional system around 800 or 900 CE, while neighboring polities continued to persist as evidenced by their participation in the Aztlan regional network that spread inland from the Pacific coast around 850-900 CE. This came to define the early post-classic period. So the fact that we don't see those materials at La Quemada suggests the site was no longer primarily occupied at that time. Evidence of environmental stability has ruled out climate change as a contributing factor in the decline of La Quemada, suggesting that social unrest or shifting political or economic networks must be considered. So arguing from a world systems perspective, Peter Jimenez has identified 2 information networks that formed through peer polity interaction during the Epiclassic period. These include what he calls the Inland Northern Network, which does include La Quemada and many other centers, as well as the Jalisco-Lima Network, which extends south to the Pacific coast. So Jimenez goes on to suggest that La Quemada's perceived inability to engage in or its choice to ignore this Jalisco Lima network contributed to its decline and abandonment. In this sense, being cut off from the post-classic world system, developing between Central and West Mexico through that Lerma-Santiago corridor may have actually impacted the long-term resilience of La Quemada. So for myself, while I find this a very compelling narrative, the lack of archaeological work in West Mexico relative to how much we know about Central Mexico, I think deserves greater attention to a more bottoms-up approaches to characterizing both the intra and interpolity interactions that would have taken place to create these sort of emergent behaviors that we see in complex adaptive systems, such as the Epiclassic period in West Mexico. So this is where the concept of collective action comes in because of the significant role it can play in the resilience of a community. So a high level of cooperation was necessary to build and maintain large ceremonial centers such as La Quemada, and to organize a ritual calendar of events that were likely hosted within its walls, especially when we recognize that this site persisted for at least 200 years. So clearly some things were going pretty well. So the goal of the study that I've conducted and I'm talking about today is to assess the capacity for collective action at multiple scales throughout the occupational history of La Quemada, to determine whether a breakdown in the social cohesion of its inhabitants contributed to the site's decline and abandonment. Within the social sciences, there's a long tradition of scholarship focused on how collective identities form and change within and across human societies that is recognized two modes by which actors identify with large groups. What we call categorical identification involves how people identify with more formal social units. These are things like political groups, religious organizations, or nationalities. Members of such groups don't always know each other personally, so symbolization is necessary to mark group membership. In such cases, individuals perceive similarities with others in these groups based on their shared identity with that social collective. As archaeologists, we analyze highly visible attributes of material cultures, such as public architecture, or in this case, widely shared ceramic styles, to help distinguish between groups, because they are assumed to represent the materialization of social identity. Relational identification, on the other hand, is formed through direct and frequent interactions among neighbors and friends, but you can also include kin ties, exchange networks, and workshops or learning communities. From this perspective, identity is constructed via processes of enculturation or habitus. So archaeologists focus on low visibility attributes of material culture, for example, pottery formation techniques and paste recipes, and which in this case, I've identified a set of 4 petrographic fabrics that I'm using to investigate patterns of relational identification that would have involved regular face-to-face interaction to learn how to make those paste recipes and use them to make pottery throughout the site's occupation. So what this graphic represents is called the collective social identification framework, and it derives from research in political science and sociology that examines the conditions under which large-scale social movements are likely to occur. According to this framework, the potential for sustained collective action is dependent on the degree to which groups of individuals share both membership in the same perceived social categories and relational networks of social interaction. So from an archaeological perspective, it is assumed that sustained collective action occurs most often among groups of people who share both highly visible ceramic styles and low visibility technological choices. So we're going to look at different scales and through time to see where we find that overlap being the highest. The diagnostic ceramic styles and forms that we see here were used by Peter Jimenez, who I referred to earlier, to define a set of interaction spheres in West Mexico. These ceramic styles provide a proxy for evaluating how the residents of La Quemada interacted or expressed their identification with neighboring polities. So while the Malpaso sphere is represented by diagnostic red on buff and negative styles, the Malpaso Valley assemblage, our ceramic assemblage that is, lacks styles and forms that define the Ixtepe El Grillo sphere, so we're not going to be considering that today. There's also only a limited presence of Valle San Luis sphere which would have come in from the east. The San Luis polychrome that we have at La Quemada looks like what you're seeing here. We only have a few shards of it, to be honest. We've got some strange forms, weird vases, straight-walled vases, and other jar forms. Connections between the Malpaso Valley and what's called the Suchil Guadiana sphere to the north have been assumed based on the shared styles of red on buff and incised engraved pottery. So La Quemada red on buff pottery has been classified as soyate red on buff, and it includes a variety of forms that you see represented here. You also see that it makes up one of the largest percentages of our decorated assemblage at the site. And although if you're familiar with the Chalchihuites sphere and other ceramic research that's happened there, you might be aware of there's like a chronology within the red on buff pottery. And we don't see that here in the Malpaso sphere yet. Although I think with some stylistic and petrographic analysis that needs a little more massaging to get some information out of, I think we might be able to tease some of that out with some more data collection going forward. Because there are other types, something like the Santa Rosa red on white, which is very similar in forms. It's similar in the decorative motifs, but there's a difference in the paint color. I'm not as convinced that maybe that's not a very distinct, completely distinct type. Anyway, we're not going to get too much into that today. The similar idea to what we see with Sierra brown on buff. Anyway, look for more information on that soon. Among the incised engraved pottery, we do have 3 types, which align somewhat with the tripartite sequence that we see in the Chalchihuites area. Our types are defined based on the timing and the nature of the incision technique that was used to execute the design motifs. So in the first case, Huizache incised engraved. This includes 7 variants within it based on their predominant motif. But all of them are executed using single line incision. And so that's what defines these as Huizache. La Quemada is another incised engraved type, and it tends to have single line or block designs with some cross hatching to designate negative space within the decoration itself. And then finally, the third one is Morguilla, and this is distinguished by full excision on the vessel surface, and then what we might call like a champleve technique. And then you can see that red pigment is used to help emphasize where the incision would have taken place. Okay, finally, we have the southern Zacatecas, northern Jalisco sphere with its diagnostic forms and styles, and those have been identified in the La Quemada assemblage. We have what's called the Guanusco white on red. It comes in these very distinctive tablilla forms. Pretty rare within our collection, but we do have it. One of the few of the resist types or negative design types that we have is Angeles bichrome or Angeles polychrome, which are pretty similar, except the polychrome has a red paint applied within the negative design space. That also distinguishes it from Ponce resist, which has a red wash or slip applied over the entire surface of the vessel after the negative design was put on. And then finally, Tepozan polychrome, which is like one of the most distinctive diagnostic types for the Malpaso sphere. It comes in a variety of forms as well. It has a very highly polished or burnished surface and very distinctive motifs. This sort of eagle motif you're seeing in the bottom of the plate there in the bottom right corner is very indicative, as well as a little coyote bear guy, who's my favorite. Last but certainly not least, we have what's called pseudo-cloisonné, and it's really penultimate, the best of the best of the ceramic types that we have. It involves very precise incising into a black clay surface that would have applied across the surface of the vessel. You can see how intricate these designs are with the placement of really beautiful pigment colors within that, and tends to happen on these copa forms. My colleague, Nora Rodriguez Aragnan, has done quite a bit of research into this particular type. It's aware. She's looked into a lot more and tied the Malpaso specific type into regional distributions based on iconography. Okay, so all of that is to show you that I took the interaction spheres for the Epiclassic period, applied them to our ceramic types to give me a sense of how I could evaluate the categorical identification of La Quemada residents based on the pottery that they consumed and used within the site. So I'm splitting it into those 3 interaction spheres, as you can see represented by the colors here. What I did then is, amongst all of those types, I selected a sample of 15 sherds of each ware, or in some cases, if it's a ware with multiple types, like you can see on resist, I selected 15 of each of those to give me a sample of almost 300 sherds to run a ceramic petrographic analysis on. I'm not going to get into too much detail on all of that. I have a recent article that I would point you to if you want to get into the details of the petrographic analysis, but I'll give you a brief overview. Previous studies had shown that that the Malhasa Valley itself is compositionally distinct from other areas in the region. So despite this being a pretty homogeneous ignimbrite complex, which you'll see actually on the next slide. I'm going to jump ahead. All this pink and yellow, these are very similar types of bedrock material that we're seeing in the valley. It's called the Sierra Madre Occidental ignimbrite complex. It's one of the largest in the world. So despite being located within this, we do see and we can identify variation chemically within the geology and within the pottery and the clays that are used to make the pottery in the Malhasa Valley. So the chemistry can be distinguished from other areas in the northern frontier. And we also are able to recognize a sort of gradational variation in terms of the chemistry from north to south along the Malpaso River as it flows down the valley. What I ended up doing was complementing our existing clay representation from previous research to fill out what we have in terms of representation across the valley. I created a set of test tiles that I could use as comparison material, knowing where the clay comes from and then comparing it to the archaeological unknowns of the clay and the pottery helps us to determine where pottery was actually being made versus where it was consumed and then discarded. Again, not going to get into too much detail on the petrography. It's a specialized technique that involves using a certain type of microscope, looking through a thin section of pottery. So you're shaving down a piece of pottery to the thinness of 30 microns. It allows light to pass through it, and it allows me to make different identifications in terms of the rock material used as temper or different minerals that are present, or even the clay properties of the clay minerals themselves can sometimes give you interesting information. So I was able to identify 4 different fabrics within this assemblage, 3 of which aligned with previous research that had been done, but a 4th is distinct. No one else had noticed this sort of rounded pumice, as I've called it. And the chemistry, so in addition to running the petrographic analysis, I ran electron microprobe to collect chemical data from the clay matrix of the pottery itself, as well as those clay samples. And I used some multivariate statistics. This is a discriminant analysis plot showing you the different colors represent the samples. The pottery sherds separated by different colors are the petrographic fabrics. And what this is showing is we're seeing that 3rd rounded pumice is pretty distinct. Looking over on the right side of the plot, there's a bit of overlap amongst the other 3, but what the discriminant analysis told me is that we're seeing pretty good distinction actually across those 4 groups. So I felt confident knowing that the petrography was supported by the chemical data and that those 4 groups are actually distinct. And so, like I said, I used the unknowns of the archaeological pottery, compared that to the known locations of the clays. And what we're able to find is there's that sort of gradational difference in the chemistry, north to south. We're seeing 3 different clay groups. But when I put the clay and the pottery together in another discriminant function analysis, we're seeing that nothing's really separating out from the others. The clays and the pottery are all in the same general space. And that gave me, again, the confidence to say that Likely, all of the decorated pottery that I analyzed, that we sampled within the Malpaso Valley, was made using local raw materials from the Malpaso Valley. So despite this pottery sharing regional styles with other parts of the northern frontier, it's being made locally within the Malpaso Valley. Okay, so again, a different way to divide up our ceramic assemblage is to then use the 300 samples in my petrographic analysis. Using a Monte Carlo approach with my colleague Matt Peoples, we were able to extrapolate that data from the 300 back out to the larger ceramic assemblage and divide it based on these petrographic fabrics instead of the regional interaction sphere styles and forms that you were seeing before. Okay, so again, those were the proxy data we were looking at. Forms and highly visible styles for categorical identification, and for relational identification, we're looking at those fabrics, so the actual materials and the choices made by potters to put different materials together when making pottery in the El Paso Valley. Okay, so to assess the potential for collective action at La Quemada, I looked at each mode of identification along the dimensions that you're seeing in this graph. So here, the y-axis shows the degree of categorical commonality from low to high based on the proportion of ceramic styles. So if you're seeing very similar proportions of ceramic styles, it's going to go up that y-axis. On the x-axis, we're seeing the strength of relational connections based on the proportions of fabric classes that are shared. So as you're moving, the increasing strength of those two modes together is going to move you up into that upper right-hand quadrant of this graph. And what that means is that the capacity for groups of people in that upper right quadrant are going to be really high. The collective potential for collective action was high. And the other quadrants on here, they represent configurations with lower capacities for collective action to be maintained over the long term. So it doesn't mean it's not possible, but if you want to have successful, sustained collective action, you want to see your case study or the group you're looking at falling in that upper right quadrant. What's most important to consider is that this is applicable at any social scale. So I'm looking at the inter-site scale, but this can also be applied to regions or interregions to look at how people identified in the past to explore collective action. All right. La Quemada is commonly divided into two sectors. We've got what's called the monumental core, and then there's also the residential terraces, which is where which is where Terrace 18 is located in the western flank. As I explained before, Terrace 18 was likely occupied by an extended family. So the material culture recovered from this area is assumed to represent the social identities of a multi-household unit. Now, due to the presence of that miniature ball court, that major causeway entrance, it's likely that Terrace 18 was not simply a residential terrace. Despite that caveat, going forward, when I'm referring to these data, I'm going to call it the Terrace 18 scale. Now, the remainder of our sample, as I've explained before, came from a set of 11 trash bidons, the red circles that you see in the site map. These materials are what we are assuming to represent the social identities of the site as a whole. So people living, attending different ceremonies, activities happening within the site would have put their trash into the middens, and that's what I'm picking up to then look at how shared collective action would have been across the site. All right, assessing the potential for collective action at both of these scales then involves comparing the proportions of ceramic styles and fabric classes recovered from both the site-wide middens and the architectural areas of Terrace 18 using a set of statistical measures. This includes what we call the Brainerd-Robinson coefficient, which determines the level of similarity between two cases that are being compared. This coefficient is useful because it allows you to create network graphs like those you see here that can be used to visualize and assess the strength of identification expressed within each spatiotemporal context that you're analyzing. So for example, the higher the number of connections within a network graph, so imagine these are the middens. If you're on the far left, you're seeing a lot of connections between middens. It means whichever mode of identification you're looking at, categorical or relational, was highly shared across all of those. Lower forms of connection of collective identification would have been on the far right in the lower end. That's not all. We're going to look at network. Well, we're not going to look at network. We're going to look at network analysis. We're also going to be able to look at this across time because the frequency seriation model that I also worked on as part of this project allowed us to actually look diachronically at behaviors and actions at La Quemada for the first time. Okay, and this slide, I'm going to walk you through what I'm referring to as trajectories of potential action, of the potential for collective action at both of the scales. And so I want you to keep in mind that the placement of each circle is along the dimension that we talked about for categorical and relational identification. And that's based on the level of similarity in those ceramic styles or fabric classes. All right, beginning with the site scale, the potential for collective action was actually moderately high in phase 1. During phase 2, the potential actually increased to very high with both modes of identification displaying statistical similarity. Unfortunately, I can't get into the third phase because we just don't have any midden data from the site scale, so we can only look at phases 1 and 2. At the Terrace 18 scale, the potential for collective action was high to very high during phase 1. Moving into phase 2, however, the degree of categorical commonality among those residents dropped from high to low, and relational identification also dropped from very high to moderately high. These changes lowered the potential for collective action substantially and contradict the very high potential observed at the site scale, right? So phase 2, we're seeing very different sorts of things happening. During phase 3, the potential for collective action within Terrace 18 appears to have rebounded back to moderately high to high levels of categorical and relational identification. So what does this all mean? While the potential for collective action increased over time at the site scale, there was a substantial decrease in recovery in the potential for collective action among the residents of Terrace 18. This finding suggests that the strength of social identification at the site scale via top-down processes may have stimulated the recovery of collective identification in Terrace 18. Alternatively, bottom-up processes caused the decline in potential for this Terrace 18 scale, may have had a delayed effect at the site scale, but we just don't have the data to look at that right now. The cause for such a drop in categorical identification within Terrace 18 may be linked to the growing influence of polities to the south in the latter part of the Epiclassic period, that it represents what we've been starting to call a pivot to the south in La Quemada's interaction with neighboring polities. So zooming back out to that regional scale, in addition to those two information networks identified by Jimenez that linked polities to one another and linked some of them into wider connections developing between West and Central Mexico, he also identified the set of interaction spheres that were based on ceramic styles. Those are the same ones that I used here to explore categorical identification within La Quemada. Drawing on their knowledge of perceived changes in the ceramic styles present in La Quemada over time, Peter Jimenez and Andy Darling have argued that while La Quemada continued to produce pottery similar to the styles found in that northern sphere, the introduction of a new pottery style later in its sequence signifies a shift towards that southern sphere. My chronological work at La Quemada has confirmed the increasing frequency of southern style pottery over time at La Quemada, thus supporting this pivot to the south model. This growing influence of the southern interaction sphere may have disrupted the coherence of categorical affiliations maintained by La Quemada residents, and it would have taken some time for the site's occupants to grow accustomed to this new sort of social division, north and south, trying to maintain connections with both. As the categorical affiliation of Terrace 18 residents increasingly pivoted south from phase 2 to phase 3, such bottom-up processes of identification likely impacted the potential for collective action, but the site's inhabitants seem to have the capacity to recover. In summary, having ruled out climate shifts as a contributing factor to the depopulation of some portions of Northwest Mexico, this study explores the social realm for other factors, specifically the role collective action played in the resilience of Northwest Mexican communities such as La Quemada. Since La Quemada dropped out of the regional system earlier than neighboring polities, it was hypothesized that a change in how its occupants identified with one another negatively impacted one or both modes of social identification and set La Quemada on a path of decreasing potential for collective action. Instead, this diachronic multiscalar analysis found that the potential for collective action was unexpectedly high late into La Quemada's occupation. In fact, it's the stability and relational identification over space and time that provided the foundation for sustained collective action in the face of fluctuations in the categorical affiliations observed within Terrace 18. In terms of the collective social identification framework, the potential for collective action within La Quemada may have fluctuated over time, but was actually strengthening leading up to the site's abandonment, meaning a change in how its inhabitants identified with one another likely did not undermine the site's social fabric. So far, these results support the grand narrative of sociopolitical development and decline provided by world systems analysis. If there was no weakening of collective action at La Quemada, then perhaps Jimenez is correct that being cut off from the post-classic world system did impact the site's resilience. In this case, Malpaso Valley inhabitants may have moved to other polities as cohesive social units that became integrated into the Aztlan phenomena of the post-classic period. Further research is necessary to characterize neighboring polities using this framework and to compare the trajectory of collective action in their occupational histories to what is now known about La Quemada. Okay, I think I have a little bit of time, so I'm going to talk about some of our ongoing and future research at the site. So I've talked a lot about collective identities within La Quemada and how they changed and fluctuated over time. But if we can look beyond La Quemada, this is going to involve collecting more petrographic and compositional data from regional ceramic styles sampled from 6 other adjacent river valleys that you see represented here. So as I explained, we do see chemical differentiation between different areas within the northern frontier. So running some more petrographic analysis on these samples will provide us with similar high and low visibility ceramic attributes of social identification, so we can start comparing their occupational histories, like I said, to what we know about La Quemada. I'm also curious to do this because if you're familiar with, I hope most of you are, the sort of migrations out of the northern southwest into the southern southwest, they're able to track those movements because of low visibility attributes in material culture. And so I think the bottom-up approach of how pottery is made, how it's moving, where people are going, is going to help us maybe figure out where the residents of La Quemada might have moved to after they left the site. This is similar to a lot of questions at branching out from a site-specific scale to a regional scale is difficult. This is something my colleagues and I started just to think about and directly target back in 2014 when I led a workshop trying to develop a ceramic metatypology for describing and classifying pottery. We looked at over 238 types recovered from 15 different sites in the region to start thinking of a common language for how we just, like I said, describe and classify pottery amongst our sites, because even though we know each other well, we still call things that look similar different. What we lacked in the end, though, was the technology to integrate our data sets using this sort of using the metatypology attributes we were collecting. Now, the more I kept talking about this problem, the more I came to realize that archaeologists in other regions also struggle with this. This is not a unique problem to West Mexico, and we all need ways of standardizing and making our data more comparable. That is what led to the development of the Pan American Ceramics Project, which launched back in 2022. This is an open access web application that I developed as an NSF postdoc. Provides a venue for digitizing new and existing ceramic data across the Americas. So we hope that it will become a communication tool for researchers to discuss and integrate their ceramic data across projects and regions, as we've already begun doing within West Mexico. And it's going to involve building a community of scholars, curators, educators, indigenous stakeholders from Canada to Argentina. We've scaled back a little bit. We're open to data from anywhere, but we've scaled back a little bit in our focus to Southwest while we develop some better protocols for how we can standardize data even at a smaller regional scale, but also how we can make the fair and care principles a major impetus for how this project moves forward. So join us. If you look at the QR code, you should be able to go right to our website or look us up at panamericanceramics.org. Okay, and then finally, in the last decade, Ben and I have been engaged in an ongoing dialogue with the INA and our Mexican colleagues about how you actually end a project in Mexico. We also had developed an idea to create a digital archive of the project, so meeting our ethical obligation and responsibility as researchers to make the data we collected accessible in perpetuity. We were lucky enough to have support from the NEH that was unfortunately taken away from us back in April with a lot of the other cuts that were going on. Despite that, we are still carrying forward with our goal of creating an archive. This has involved a lot of research and collaboration with Mexican colleagues. You can see some of our students helping us in the lab there in the photo, documenting data on all of the different material culture we have, not just pottery, even though that's my favorite. We are working with the team, the TDAR team, the Digital Archaeological Record, which is also based at ASU, to build a collection within their website, within their repository for the project itself. It's going to include all the different types of information you see listed here. But one of our primary foci has been, well, you should always build a digital archive because it's, as I said, it's the way to meet your ethical obligations as researchers. Be more collaborative, provide access to data for future reuse, and highly recommend. Sorry, what I meant to say is we've been focusing on about 1,600 objects that represent the best of the best. Our digital reference collection is what we've been calling it. There's going to have high quality photos, all the metadata we can provide about these individual objects, which represent the greater collection itself. You would be able to then go into the collection. If you said you wanted to take a look at figurines, you'll be prompted then to select from some of the other metadata if you want to give you a sort of search result based on images. Like I said, high quality images that we're taking, we finished taking this last summer. We've also started experimenting with photogrammetry. So we're creating 3D models that will hopefully be used in classroom settings. Educators can print these, museum settings. You can have actual interactive objects that kids can touch and feel the past, which I think will be really neat. And I can show you a few if we have time, but I probably should just wrap things up. Ultimately, this is going to serve a lot of the different audiences you're seeing here. And yeah, we're trying to wrap things up in the next year or two. So I wanted to just end by thanking all of my colleagues who contributed to all this research over the years and all the support that we've had for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. If you want to show some of those photos, we got time.
Okay, sure.
There's one question so far, so after you show those models, you can probably answer that one. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. So can you see the little figurine head?
Yeah.
So yeah, this is photos. I just took photos on a cool little turning, oh, what's that called? A turntable, automatic turntable. It takes photos as I go along. I think this is looking pretty good compared to the object itself. Some of these, the figurines are really nice. You can see the little feet that they would have stood on their own. The necklace itself, I mean, the details, pretty good. This is a rather large tripod Oya, one of the more complete vessels. We don't have a whole lot of complete vessels in our collection. This is another one, much smaller. Little Oya, Santiago, white on red vessel. And let's see. Oh, this is a cool little coyote ornament. So you can even see where they would have drilled the little hole to probably put it on a necklace or something like that. So yeah.
That's cool. That's going to be on the TDAR website?
They will be. Yeah, TDAR is actually working on developing their own 3D visualization tool within the website too.
Awesome. So if you go to the Q&A section there, Sally asked that question. So if you can answer that.
Interesting. Oh, sorry. Well, it's not my area of expertise, but what I'm aware of is people were leaving, like you said, leaving the Four Corners region, moving south into the southern Arizona, and the researchers have been able to look at like the low visibility attributes I was talking about are things like domestic architecture. So there's certain features within the houses themselves that are distinctive, and as well as certain types of pottery. What am I thinking of? They're these like disc kind of things. They're very distinctive. But basically, with the domestic architecture, you can imagine the way you build your house. You learn that from a pretty young age, or you learn that directly from your family, your kin group. So despite these people moving from northern Arizona or northern Southwest to southern Southwest, they're still building their houses in a similar way. So that's kind of a way they're able to say we're following those migrants south because we're seeing that they're still making their houses in a similar style as they did where they came from. So if we look at that pottery way and pottery wise as well, formation techniques don't tend to change as easily as the the styles with which you decorate your pottery or the form of the pottery that you make. Those can be really easily influenced by different economic, political factors. You work in a marketplace, you sell your pottery, you're going to make it look like what people want to buy. But the paste recipe you follow, how you combine the raw materials, and the actual forming techniques you use to create the vessel body, that doesn't change quite as easily. That's inherited. You learn that directly through apprenticeships. So we don't see those things change as often.
Okay, Andrea, can you read the question aloud? Some people,
Oh, I'm so
because
sorry.
yeah, they can't see the actual question, so
Okay, sorry. I'm new to this. The question was about wanting more information about the migrations that included Mesa Verde on the slide that I was talking about. So they were asking me to revisit that a little bit and explain a little bit more about how we know migrants were moving south from Mesa Verde. Sorry about that.
thank you. And there's a second question, if you can read that one.
Yes, so this question, have you 3D printed any of the models as replicas, and what purposes do you think would best be served by it? I have not done that yet, but I want to do it really soon for an event that we have coming up in Zacatecas, so I need to get on that. My colleagues, though, have done some 3D printing of other pottery here in Florida that we've worked with. And some printers can print to realistic colors, so you don't have to do anything after the printing is done. Others, though, you can print as white, and then as an artist yourself, you're able to paint them to look more realistic to the artifacts themselves. And I'm not sure I'm that skilled as an artist, but I'm going to give it a go and we'll see how it looks. So what I see it serving is, like I said, outreach materials for in-classroom activities is a goal of mine. Not everyone can go and visit these sites, so you're not even able to go see a museum that has objects from an archaeological site. I think it'd be better to bring the site or parts of the site to classrooms all around the world. Doesn't have to be just in Mexico or the US. So that's what I see it being used for.
All right. Any more questions? If not, we're gonna have to let Andrea go because it's what, 11 o'clock where you're at?
Yeah, it's a little late.
So, well, thank you for staying out with us. That was really interesting.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I
No
enjoyed that very
problem.
much.
Yeah, feel free to email me if you have any questions. And
Okay.
yeah, this was a pleasure.
All
Thank
right. Join us next month. Then we'll go back to Colorado for
you.
next month's lecture. So thank you, everybody.
Yay.
Have a good night, Andrea.
Bye.
See
Thanks
you
so
next
much.
time. Bye.
Bye-bye.